The crowd surged forward like a wave of fury, and Ruby Prentice felt the world collapsing around her. She had nowhere left to run. Her back pressed against the rough-hewn timber of the general store, the wood grain biting through the thin cotton of her dress, and the faces before her were twisted with something uglier than anger. There were 30, maybe 40 men gathered in the dusty main street of Callow Creek, Texas, and every one of them had been told a lie. A beautifully constructed, devastating lie. Thief. The word came again from the back of the crowd, amplified by the afternoon heat and the hollow acoustics of the empty street. She stole from the Hartwell estate. My daddy's pocket watch, his silver, his deed papers. That voice belonged to Clarence Hartwell, and Ruby knew that voice the way a person knows the sound of a trap snapping shut. She had worked for his father for 3 years, faithfully, diligently, without complaint, and now Gerald Hartwell was dead and Clarence had inherited everything except the conscience that would have prevented this moment. The crowd pressed closer. Someone threw a handful of dirt. Another man grabbed the edge of her sleeve, and the fabric tore with a sound that felt like judgment. "String her up until the sheriff comes back," a voice called, casual and horrifying, as though he were suggesting they move the dance to a different saloon. Ruby's vision swam. She was going to die here, in the street where she had bought sugar and lamp oil and bolts of blue fabric, in the town where she had tried so carefully to build something resembling a life. She was going to die for a crime she had not committed, and no one was going to stop it. Then the crowd went quiet, not slowly, not in pieces. All at once, as though every man present had simultaneously lost the ability to speak. She could not see why at first, because her eyes were blurred with tears she refused to let fall. But she felt it, the way the pressure of the mob changed, the way the bodies shifted. Someone stepped backward, then another, then several more, creating a corridor of silence in the packed street, and through that corridor came Flint Farrow. He moved without hurry, which was itself a kind of power. His boots raised small puffs of dust with each step, and his hands were loose at his sides, not reaching for the Colt at his hip but not far from it either. He was tall enough that his shadow fell across Ruby before he reached her, and when he finally stopped, he was standing directly between her and the crowd, his broad back a wall she had not known she needed. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply stood there, and the silence he carried with him was more commanding than any shout. Then he spoke, low and clear, in a voice that did not invite argument. "She is under my protection." 6 weeks earlier, Ruby Prentice had arrived in Callow Creek with $42, a carpet bag containing everything she owned, and a letter of recommendation from a schoolteacher in Abilene, who had taken pity on her when her previous situation had dissolved. She had stepped off the stagecoach into the October heat and looked at the sun-bleached buildings, the horses tied to the rail outside Maddox's saloon, the women in calico dresses moving purposefully along the boardwalk, and she had thought, with the stubborn optimism that had kept her alive for 26 years, that this might work. She had not come to Callow Creek by choice. Choice, in Ruby's experience, was a luxury extended to people with family and money and roots. She had none of those things. What she had was practicality, a talent for bookkeeping learned from her father before the consumption took him, a genuine skill with a household, and the ability to remain composed when everything around her was falling apart. These were useful qualities, and they had kept her employed, more or less steadily, since she was 19. Gerald Hartwell had hired her as his household manager and bookkeeper with efficiency and reasonable pay, and for 3 years she had managed his accounts, supervised the domestic staff, organized his correspondence, and treated him with the respect owed to an elderly man who was, underneath his gruffness, fundamentally decent. Gerald had died of a heart failure on a Tuesday morning in September, and by Wednesday afternoon, Clarence Hartwell had arrived from San Antonio with 2 leather trunks and a possessive gleam in his eye. Clarence was 38 years old, well-dressed in the way of men who want you to notice that they are well-dressed, and he regarded Ruby the way he regarded all the furnishings of his father's estate, as things that had been there before him and would be there to serve him now. He had been pleasant for exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, he had suggested that Ruby's responsibilities might expand in ways that had nothing to do with bookkeeping, and Ruby had made it very clear, in the most controlled voice she could manage, that she would be leaving his employ. She had packed her carpetbag that evening. She had taken her $42 in wages, owed to her for the month, from the household cash box. She had written it carefully in the ledger, the way she wrote everything, and left the entry clear and documented. That was all she had taken. Clarence, it appeared, intended to claim otherwise. The morning after her arrival in Callow Creek, which she had chosen because the stage ran through it and the fare was within her means, Ruby had found lodging at the boarding house run by Martha Gentry, a compact and businesslike widow who asked no unnecessary questions and charged a fair rate. Ruby had then presented herself at the office of Mr. Thomas Ackerman, the land agent whose advertisement she had seen posted at the stage depot in Abilene, who was looking for a clerk to manage his property records. She had gotten the job because Ruby Prentice was good at what she did, and because Mr. Ackerman, who was 61 and had bad eyesight, recognized competence when it explained itself clearly. For 6 weeks, she had come to work each morning, processed deeds and lease agreements and boundary surveys, kept the files in meticulous order, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that Clarence Hartwell might be looking for her. She had thought about it anyway. She had thought about it while she lay in her narrow bed at Martha Gentry's boarding house and listened to the night sounds of a Texas town, the dogs, the distant music from the saloon, the occasional creak of the building settling in the autumn air. She had thought about it while she ate her meals at the long table in Martha's dining room, surrounded by the other boarders, a retired surveyor named Henry, a young telegraph operator named Samuel, and an itinerant preacher named Elias who talked too much and ate too little. She had thought about it while she walked to work along the boardwalk and smiled at the people she was beginning to recognize: the baker's wife, the blacksmith's apprentice, the doctor's young daughter who always seemed to be chasing a chicken. She had tried to build something here. She had tried so carefully to build something here. Flint Farrow, she had known by reputation before she ever spoke to him. In a town the size of Callow Creek, which held perhaps 400 souls and the various people who passed through it, reputation was currency. You heard things without trying. You learned who owned what, who was trusted, who was not, which of the ranchers were struggling and which were expanding, which men paid their debts and which needed a second visit before they remembered their obligations. From the general conversation of the town, from Mr. Ackerman's occasional commentary on his clients, from Martha Gentry's remarkably well-informed opinions on the character of every significant person within 20 miles, Ruby had assembled a picture of Flint Farrow before she ever laid eyes on him. He owned the Farrow Ranch, 1,200 acres of good grassland 5 miles north of town. He had built it himself, starting from nothing, starting from a 2-room cabin and 40 head of cattle over the course of 14 years. He was 32 years old. He did not drink heavily or gamble recklessly or trouble women who did not want to be troubled. He was known to be fair in his business dealings, demanding in his expectations, and silent in his habits. The last quality was mentioned more often than the others, and always with a specific kind of emphasis that suggested it was not ordinary quietness, but something more deliberate. Martha Gentry, who had an opinion on everything, put it this way: Flint Farrow is a man who has decided that most of what gets said in this world is not worth saying. He has not been wrong yet. Ruby had been curious, in a detached, observational way. The kind of curiosity she permitted herself, which was careful and maintained behind a professional distance. She had seen him for the first time when he came into Mr. Ackerman's office to discuss a boundary adjustment on the eastern section of his land. He had removed his hat, which a surprising number of men forgot to do, and he had greeted Mr. Ackerman with a nod and Ruby with a nod of slightly different quality, one that acknowledged her presence without reducing it. He was dark-haired, with the kind of face that the sun and the outdoor life had arranged into clean, strong lines. His eyes were a very particular shade of gray, the color of sky before a weather change, and they had a habit of looking at things steadily that was somehow different from staring. He had said perhaps 40 words during the entire meeting, and every one of them had been necessary. She had thought about him afterward, in the way she thought about things that did not fit neatly into her existing categories. He was not like the other men she encountered, the ones who performed loudly and asked questions designed to demonstrate their own importance. There was a quality of containment about Flint Farrow that she found, to her own mild surprise, extremely compelling. She had firmly redirected that particular line of thought, because Ruby Prentice was not in a position to find anyone compelling. She was in a position to keep her head down, and her records accurate and her situation stable, and those were the priorities. Then Clarence Hartwell had arrived in Callow Creek. She had not seen him come. She had been at her desk, carefully transcribing a boundary survey, when Mr. Ackerman had come back from his midday meal with an expression on his face that she had not seen before, a combination of regret and discomfort, and something that might have been shame. "Miss Prentice," he had said, standing in the doorway in a way that suggested he did not want to enter his own office. "There is a man. He came to my house. He says he is Gerald Hartwell's son from San Antonio." Ruby had set down her pen very carefully. "He says you stole from his father's estate," Mr. Ackerman had continued, and his voice was apologetic, but his eyes were not quite meeting hers. "He has a document. He says it is a sworn affidavit from 2 of his father's servants." Ruby had stood up from her desk, her back very straight. "I did not steal anything, Mr. Ackerman. I took my wages, which were owed to me, and I recorded them in the household ledger before I left. The entry is there in my own handwriting." "I believe you," Mr. Ackerman had said, and she thought he probably meant it. "But he has spoken to several people in town already this morning. He went to the sheriff first, but Sheriff Danaher is away in Sweetwater until Friday. He went to the mayor. He has been speaking to people on the street." He had paused. "Miss Prentice, I think it might be best if you remained inside today." But the warning had come too late, because even as Mr. Ackerman spoke, she could hear the sound beginning outside. The growing sound of a crowd collecting, the way crowds collected in towns like this one, quickly and without much individual intention, each person drawn by the one before. And before she understood what was happening, she had stepped outside to understand the nature of the sound, and found herself facing 40 men who had already decided what the truth was. Clarence Hartwell was good at telling stories. She had not given him enough credit for that. He had the kind of plausible, injured manner, the bereaved son wronged by a trusted employee, that lands deeply in the chest of people who have been wronged themselves, and are looking for someone to be angry on behalf of. He had spoken their language of betrayal and theft, and the ingratitude of those who are taken in and helped. And the crowd had collected around his narrative the way water collects in low ground. They had backed her against the general store wall, and she had been looking at her own death, and then Flint Pharaoh had walked through the middle of it. He stood now with his back to her and his face to the crowd, and the silence he had created was holding, which was itself remarkable. Clarence Hartwell recovered first. He was a man accustomed to recovering quickly, which was, Ruby had come to understand, one of the more dangerous qualities a dishonest person could possess. "Pharaoh," Clarence said, adjusting his expression into something reasonable and offended. "This is not your concern. This woman is a thief and a criminal, and when the sheriff returns, the sheriff will determine what she is," Flint said. His voice was quiet enough that the men at the edges of the crowd had to lean slightly to hear it, which meant they were listening with their whole attention. "Until he does, she is under my protection. Anyone who wants to reach her will have to go through me first." He said this with complete absence of drama, as though he were stating a fact about the weather or the price of cattle, and it was perhaps this quality more than anything else that made it land so heavily. There was a long moment where the crowd recalibrated. Ruby could not see Flint's face, but she could see the faces of the men before him, and she watched the specific calculation that moves through a crowd when it is presented with an obstacle it had not anticipated. One by one, in different intervals and for different reasons, men began to step backward. Some looked away. Some found reasons to consult their pocket watches or examine their boots. Clarence Hartwell was the last to yield, and he did not yield entirely. He fixed his eyes on Ruby over Flint's shoulder with an expression that was a promise, and then he put his hat back on his head and walked away down the street with his 2 hired men trailing behind him. The crowd dissolved in the way crowds always dissolve, when the momentum that created them is gone, in small, self-conscious groups, with a collective pretense that none of them had particularly wanted to be there in the first place. The street was quiet. Ruby realized that her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and commanded them to stop, and they mostly obliged. Flint turned around. Up close, his gray eyes were more complex than they appeared at a distance. There were lines around them that came from squinting into the sun, and something behind them that she could not immediately name. He looked at her face in that steady way of his, and what she saw in his expression was not pity, which she would not have been able to bear, but something more like recognition. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Thank you." She paused because the words did not feel sufficient for what he had just done. "That was not a small thing, Mr. Pharaoh." "No," he agreed. "It was not." He looked down the street in the direction Clarence Hartwell had gone. "He will not let this rest, I know." She took a breath. "He manufactured evidence. He has an affidavit from servants who either lied for him or were paid to. The actual ledger, the one with my entry showing the withdrawal of my wages, is in the Hartwell house in San Antonio." He looked back at her. "Do you have any proof you kept?" "I have a habit of keeping copies," she said. "I copied that ledger entry before I left. It is in my room at Martha Gentry's boarding house." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Then we have something to work with." She noticed the word "we." She was too disoriented to examine it properly, so she filed it away for later. "Why did you do that?" she asked, because she needed to understand. "You do not know me. You have no reason to involve yourself in my troubles." Flint was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was choosing words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground, deliberately and without waste. "I know what I saw," he said at last. "And what I saw was a woman being made into a target by a man with money and a crowd willing to believe him. I have seen that before, and it does not end in justice on its own. She held his gaze. There was something in what he said that went beyond the immediate situation, some private knowledge folded into those words, and she did not press it. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we get your copy of that ledger, and then we send a telegram to San Antonio." They walked side by side to Martha Gentry's boarding house. Martha herself was at the front window, and when she saw them coming, her expression was a complicated mixture of relief and sharp curiosity. She opened the door before they reached the steps. "I saw from the window," Martha said. "Flint Farrow, you are either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Flint said, and Martha made a sound that might have been a surprised laugh. Ruby retrieved the copy of the ledger entry from the flat bottom of her carpet bag, where she kept it folded inside a piece of oilcloth. She had written it out herself in her most careful hand. The date, the amount, the notation that it represented 1 month's wages owed and received, and the initials she always used to confirm her own entries. Looking at it now, in the light coming through the window of Martha's sitting room, it looked like exactly what it was. Proof. Flint examined it without touching it, leaning slightly forward to read, and then straightened. "This will be enough for Danaher when he returns," he said. But Hartwell will not wait for Danaher. He will try again before Friday. "Then what do you suggest?" Martha asked. She had settled into her chair near the window with the alert, watchful quality of a woman who has navigated difficult situations before. "I suggest Miss Prentice not be alone," Flint said. He looked at Ruby. "He has 2 men with him. I saw them in town last week." Ruby noticed that he had been paying attention to things before this afternoon. She was not sure what to make of that. "You will stay here," Martha said to Ruby, with the decisive quality that made it clear this was not a question. "I have Thomas with his rifle, and I will send for Henry as well." Thomas was Martha's son, who lived in the adjoining property. Henry was the retired surveyor, who was in his 60s but vigorous and not without resources. "I will speak to some people," Flint said. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the side table. "Danaher needs to be reached in Sweetwater. Someone needs to ride out today." "Samuel can send a telegram from the office," Ruby said. Samuel, the telegraph operator, was one of the boarders. "If we get a message to the sheriff's office in Sweetwater—" "I will handle that," Flint said. Then he paused and looked at her again with that steady, attentive look. "Miss Prentice." "I meant what I said in the street. You are under my protection. That does not expire when I leave this room." She met his gaze. She was 32 years old enough to maintain appropriate distance, and she had learned through practice not to attach significance to kindness unless it was consistent and proven over time. One dramatic gesture in a street, however brave, was not a relationship. But something in his voice when he said it moved through her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. "Thank you, Mr. Farrow," she said. "I will try not to require too much protecting." A faint warmth came into his expression. "That would be my preference as well." He left. Martha looked at Ruby with an expression that contained an entire conversation without a single word. "Do not," Ruby said. "I have not said anything," Martha said with magnificent innocence. The next 2 days were the longest Ruby had experienced in recent memory, and her experience of long days was considerable. Flint's efforts were methodical and effective in ways she could only partially see from her position inside Martha's boarding house. Samuel had sent the telegram to Sweetwater. Word had spread through certain reliable channels, as word does in a small town when the right people carry it, that Ruby Prentice was under the protection of Flint Farrow, and that this was not a casual announcement. Men who might have been inclined to form another mob, or to harass her at Mr. Ackerman's office, found reasons to stay away. Clarence Hartwell was still in Callow Creek. He had taken a room at the hotel and was spending money freely at Maddox's saloon, which was, Ruby thought grimly, a time-tested method of building allies. She heard about this from Martha, who heard about it from the baker's wife, who heard about it from the blacksmith's apprentice. The information chain of a small town was both a comfort and an anxiety, because it meant she was informed, but it also meant Clarence knew exactly where she was. Flint came to Martha's boarding house on the evening of the first day. He sat in the parlor and ate the dinner Martha provided with the apparently unconscious ability to be still and quiet in a room without making the stillness uncomfortable. Ruby sat across from him at the table and they talked, carefully at first, and then with increasing naturalness, about the situation, and then about other things. She learned that he had come to Texas from Missouri 14 years ago, at age 18, with the money his parents had left him when a fever took them both within a week of each other. He had bought the first 40 head of cattle and the cabin and 200 acres, and he had built the rest himself, year by year. He had hired men who proved themselves trustworthy and kept them long-term, which was how you knew the character of a rancher. Martha had once explained, not by how many men he hired but by how many stayed. He had never married. He said this without particular emphasis, as a piece of factual information, and she did not examine it further. She told him that she had never married either, that she had moved frequently, following available work, that she had spent her 20s in a series of positions for households and businesses and land offices, and had accumulated, in place of a conventional life, a considerable depth of practical knowledge and a somewhat exhausted hope for permanence. She said this last part more honestly than she intended, and he looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said quietly, "Permanence is harder to come by than they tell you when you are young." "Yes," she said, and felt with some surprise that she had been understood. He left after dinner. He came back the following morning, bringing a man named Cobb, who was one of his ranch hands, a large and placid man who settled himself on the front porch of the boarding house with the easy comfort of someone who had been asked to do exactly the thing he was best suited for. Cobb did not talk much either. There seemed to be a quality about Flint Farrow that's selected for a particular type of company. The telegram response came on the afternoon of the second day. Sheriff Danaher was cutting his trip short and would arrive in Callow Creek by Thursday evening. He asked that all parties involved remain in town and available. Clarence Hartwell heard about this almost immediately, which told Ruby something about the nature of the telegraph office, or possibly about how freely Clarence had been spending money. She heard, through the same chain by which she heard everything, that he had sent for someone, though no one could say precisely who. Flint heard this too. He came to the boarding house that evening with an expression that was careful in a way she was learning to read as concern he was not allowing to become alarm. "Who did he send for?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said. But a man like Hartwell, when he feels his claim threatened, does not rely only on a crowd. He will have prepared for the possibility of an official inquiry. They were in the parlor again, sitting across from each other in the lamplight, and Ruby was aware of the quality of the space between them. The way awareness moves through air when two people are paying close attention to each other without acknowledging it directly. "He will claim the ledger copy is fabricated," she said. "Yes," Flint agreed. "That is why I also sent a telegram." She looked at him. "To a man in San Antonio," he said. "An attorney who I have done business with. His name is James Croft. I asked him to locate the Hartwell household ledger and have it examined by an independent clerk." Ruby was quiet for a moment, absorbing the scope of what he had done. He had anticipated the need and acted on it quietly, without presenting it as a favor or using it to create an obligation. He had simply done it. "That will take time," she said. "It may not need to be completed before Friday. If Croft can confirm that the original ledger entry exists and matches your copy, that will be sufficient for Danaher to hold Hartwell on a charge of filing a false affidavit." "Clarence has friends in San Antonio," she said. "Croft is thorough," Flint said. "And he is not impressed by friends." She looked at him across the small distance of the parlor, and something between them shifted slightly, the way light shifts when a cloud passes and the angle changes. "Mr. Farrow," she said. "Flint." She used his given name without planning to, and then continued before the moment could become awkward about it. "Why are you doing all of this? I need to understand, because I do not accept help without understanding its nature." He was quiet for a moment that was longer than most of his silences, which was itself informative. "When I came to Texas," he said finally, "I was 18 years old and I had nobody. A man in this territory, without family and without connections, has a reasonable chance of making his own way if he is willing to work and willing to be patient. A woman in the same situation has much narrower margins." He paused. "My mother was a woman of considerable ability and intelligence. She deserved a wider life than she got. I have thought about that over the years." He said this without sentimentality, as a plain statement of a plain truth, and it was one of the most affecting things anyone had ever said to her. "I also," he said, and now his voice was quieter, "find myself thinking about you rather more than I have thought about anyone in some time." The honesty of it was almost startling, not artful, not performed, simply true. Ruby took a breath. "I think about you as well," she said, matching his directness, "which is inconvenient given the circumstances." "It is," he agreed, and then, with the ghost of that almost smile, "I thought I should mention it." "Yes," she said, "I am glad you did." That was all they said about it that evening. But something had been named, and named things are different from unnamed things, and neither of them was unaware of the difference. Thursday arrived with the particular quality of a day that has been waited for. Flint had spent the night in the stable attached to Martha's property, on a cot he had borrowed from Cobb, because the person who had sent for Clarence Hartwell had arrived on Wednesday evening stage. He was a man named Reese, a private investigator of some kind based in Austin, and he had the look of someone who was paid to find weaknesses in other people's cases and was good at his work. Ruby had sat in the parlor Wednesday night and looked at the lamplight on the walls and thought, with clear-eyed realism, about all the ways this could still go wrong. Clarence had money. Money, in 1882 in a small Texas town, was a formidable opponent. The ledger entry might be challenged. Her testimony might be dismissed. A woman alone against a wealthy man's accusation had lost before. She had also thought about Flint, on a cot in the stable. There, because he had decided she was worth being there for, and she had felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in the middle of difficult circumstances. She had felt not quite alone. The sheriff arrived on the Thursday evening stage, dusty from the road and apparently unsurprised to find a complicated situation awaiting him. James Danaher was in his 40s, steady and deliberate in his movements, and he wore his badge with the casual authority of someone who has earned it long enough ago that he no longer thinks about it. He interviewed Ruby first, in Mr. Ackerman's office, which Ackerman had made available with evident relief at having an official framework to operate within. Ruby presented her copy of the ledger entry, explained the circumstances of her departure from the Hartwell estate, and told the story precisely and without embellishment. She had learned early in her life that the plain truth is always cleaner than any embroidered version, and it showed in the telling. Danaher listened without interrupting. He looked at the document. He asked 3 specific questions, all of them pertinent. Then he interviewed Clarence Hartwell, with Reese present as an advisor, and Ruby did not know what passed in that conversation. She waited on the bench outside the office, and Flint sat beside her, not touching her but close enough that she was aware of his presence the way you are aware of warmth, peripherally but definitely. "He will have prepared something," she said quietly. "Yes," Flint said. "But Croft sent a return message this morning." She looked at him. "The original ledger entry is present and matches your copy exactly," he said. "Croft has a signed statement from the Hartwell household's cook, a woman named Louise, who witnessed you make the entry on the day you left. She did not lie for Clarence. He apparently did not offer her enough. Ruby absorbed this. He paid the other 2 servants. It appears so, which Croft also documented." Flint paused. "Danaher has all of this. I gave it to him before he began the interviews." She turned to look at him fully. He was watching the door of the office with that characteristic stillness, but she could see the careful attention underneath it, the way this mattered to him. "You prepared for every possibility," she said. "I tried to," he said. "You have been doing this since the first day," she said. "Before you even knew whether the telegram to Croft would produce anything useful." He turned to look at her then, and the gray eyes were direct and warm and entirely without pretense. "Yes," he said simply. She held his gaze, and something settled in her chest, something that had been tense and watchful and guarded for longer than she could properly account for. Not completely, not yet, but perceptibly. The door opened. Danaher came out first, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who has sorted something out. "Miss Prentice," he said, "I owe you an apology on behalf of this town. You should not have been left unprotected when that crowd formed. My deputy should have intervened." He paused. "Mr. Hartwell is in custody pending charges of filing a false affidavit and incitement. His man, Reese, has been advised to leave Callow Creek." Behind him, she could see Clarence Hartwell through the open doorway, sitting in a chair with the specific expression of a man who has miscalculated and not yet fully accepted it. He looked at Ruby with a fury that he was barely containing, and she met his gaze without flinching, because she was done flinching. "The charges will go to the circuit court," Danaher continued. "I would ask you to remain in the county until the matter is formally resolved, which should be within the month. After that, you are entirely free." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. Danaher looked at Flint with an expression of complicated approval. "I hear you held a crowd off single-handedly." "There was no fighting," Flint said. "That was the impressive part," Danaher said, and went back inside. Ruby stood up from the bench. The October evening air was cool and the street was quiet, and the sun was setting behind the buildings in shades of deep orange and copper, and she was, for the first time in a week, entirely safe. She turned to Flint. He was looking at her with an expression she could read now, because she had been learning to read his expressions the way you learn a language, one word at a time, through attention and willingness. He was relieved. More relieved than the situation strictly required. More relieved than you would be for a near stranger. "It is over," she said. "This part of it," he agreed. She almost smiled. "You are a man who thinks in terms of next problems." "There is usually a next problem," he said. "And yet," she said, "here you are." They stood in the orange light of the street in front of Mr. Ackerman's office, and neither of them moved for a moment. And the evening held them in it the way the very best moments hold you, fully, without pressure. "Ruby," he said. Her given name the first time he had used it. "Yes," she said. "I would like to call on you formally," he said. "If you are willing." She looked at him. Formal calling was a clear and specific language in 1882, and he was using it precisely and deliberately. He was not suggesting something casual or undefined. He was offering something with the specific gravity of a real intention. "I am willing," she said. He nodded, with the profound, quiet satisfaction of a man who has just received the answer to the question that mattered most. They walked back to Martha's boarding house in the falling evening, not quite side by side but close enough, and the space between them felt like possibility. The weeks that followed had a quality that Ruby had not experienced before and had not known to expect. Flint came to call on Tuesday and Saturday evenings, which were the evenings she was not working at Mr. Ackerman's office for his late correspondence, and he came with the consistency that she had identified as one of his defining characteristics. He was always on time. He always had something to talk about, which was interesting given his general economy with words, because, in fact, he had thoughts about many things, well-considered and specific thoughts, and what he had simply determined was that most social occasions did not warrant them. With her, it turned out they did. They talked about cattle breeding, which she knew little about but found, when he explained it, genuinely interesting. They talked about land law, which she knew a great deal about from her time at Mr. Ackerman's office. They talked about Missouri and Texas, and the people they had known and the books they had read. And she discovered that he had a modest but well-chosen library in the ranch house, which he had been building over years, and which included, to her delight, a volume of George Eliot. "Middlemarch," she said when he mentioned it. "That is one of my favorite novels." "I have read it twice," he said, with the mild defensiveness of a man who expects to be surprised about. "I am not surprised," she said. "It is a book about people who do not get what they deserve, and about the ones who eventually do. You seem like someone who would find that worth reading twice." He looked at her with that look that she had come to think of as his particular expression for her, attentive and warm and a little undone. Martha watched all of this with enormous satisfaction, and the self-restraint of a woman who has learned not to celebrate prematurely. The circuit court came in November, and the proceedings were brief by the standards of legal proceedings. The evidence was clear, the documentation from San Antonio was thorough, and Clarence Hartwell, despite his attorney's considerable efforts, was found liable for the filing of a false affidavit. He paid a significant fine and left Callow Creek under a cloud that followed him in the way that bad reputations follow wealthy men, not quickly enough to satisfy justice, but perceptibly, and with lasting effect. Ruby heard, some months later, that he had also been challenged by two of his father's other former employees who had their own documented grievances, which gave her a grim and private satisfaction. She remained at Mr. Ackerman's office, and Mr. Ackerman, who had been somewhat ashamed of his own initial hesitation, gave her a raise in December without being asked. She and Flint walked on Sunday afternoons, along the creek that gave the town its name, a thin and persistent stream edged with cottonwood trees that went gold in November, and then bare. They walked and talked and occasionally were quiet in the comfortable way that comes when two people have graduated past the necessity of filling silence. On one of these walks, in early December, she asked him the question she had been holding for some weeks. "What did you see that day in the street, when you walked through the crowd? What made you do it?" He thought about this in his characteristic way, not quickly, but with the care that meant the answer would be accurate. "I saw a woman who had been cornered," he said. "And I saw that the cornering was unjust, and that no one else was going to do anything about it." He paused. "But that is not complete. There are injustices in the world that I see and do not personally intervene in, because I cannot be everywhere and there are limits to what one man can do. He paused again. I saw you. She looked at him. I had been watching you since you first came to Mr. Ackerman's office, he said. Not in a way I would be ashamed of, but I had been paying attention, and the thought of anything happening to you was something I found that I could not tolerate. The cottonwood trees stood bare and still around them, and the December air was cold and clean. I did not know that, she said. I thought it might be apparent, he said, with the faintest self-deprecating quality. I thought it might be, she admitted, but I was trying not to assume. He smiled then, fully, which was something he did rarely enough that, when he did it, it rearranged his face completely. She realized, looking at it, that she had been trying very hard not to love this man and that she had failed thoroughly and that this was entirely all right. Ruby, he said. Yes, she said. And they were both smiling now, standing in the December light under the bare cottonwood trees, and he reached out and took her hand with the deliberate, careful quality he brought to everything that mattered, and they stood there for a long time. Christmas in Callow Creek was a modest affair by the standards of cities, but warm in the particular way of small communities, with a service at the church and a gathering at the town hall with a fiddle player and a supper brought by every household in town. Ruby went with Martha and the boarders, and Flint was there with his ranch hands, Cobb and two others named Garrett and Amos, and at some point in the evening they were simply standing together and talking with whoever was nearby, and it had stopped being a thing that required comment. Martha, dancing with the retired surveyor Henry, caught Ruby's eye across the room and made a very small, satisfied nod. Ruby made a small, surrendering nod back. On the day after Christmas, Flint asked her to come and see the ranch. He drove her out in a spring wagon, because the December air was too cold for a horse ride of 5 miles without adequate shelter, and the ranch appeared gradually as they came over a rise. First the fence lines, and then the outbuildings, and then the main house, which was larger than she had expected, built from good stone and timber, with a long porch along the front and windows that faced south to catch the winter light. He showed her the house with a quietness that she understood. He was not giving a tour. He was showing her something. The kitchen was practical and well-equipped. The sitting room had the library she had been told about, the shelves built into the wall beside the fireplace, the books arranged with care. The 2 bedrooms and the smaller room that had served as a study. The stone fireplace in the main room, which was large enough to heat the house through a hard winter. The view from the porch across the grass, which in December was winter pale but vast and peaceful. She stood on the porch and looked out at it, and he stood beside her. I built the first room in the winter of 1868, he said. I was 19. I did not know what I was doing, and it showed. I rebuilt the walls of that room twice. Which room is it? The study, he said. The walls are a little uneven if you look carefully. I left them to remind myself. She looked at him. Of what? That things built right the second time are worth the first attempt going wrong, he said. She took a breath of cold December air. I have been thinking, she said carefully, in the voice she used when she was about to say something she had considered thoroughly, about what I want, not what is available or practical or advisable, what I actually want. He turned to look at her, and his full attention was on her entirely. I want to stop moving, she said. I have been moving since I was 19 and I am tired of it. I want a place and work that is meaningful and people I trust. She paused. I want this. He looked at her for a long moment. I want to do this correctly, he said. I want to ask your permission before I say what I want to say. You have it, she said. Then I am asking you to marry me, he said. Not because it is convenient or appropriate, though it may also be those things. Because you are the person I want to build a life with, and I have known that since you looked at me across Mr. Ackerman's desk and told me, with complete composure, exactly why you were right about the boundary survey." She stared at him. "That was the first time we met." "Yes," he said. "I told you that you were wrong about the eastern boundary marker." "You were correct," he said, "and the way you told me was extraordinary." She started to laugh, which was not the response she had expected to make to a proposal of marriage, but it was genuine and warm, and he looked at it with an expression of absolute delight. "Yes," she said, when the laughter had settled into something that was still warm. "I will marry you, Flint Farrow. I believe I have been intending to for some time." He took both her hands, there on the porch of the Stone Ranch house in the December light, and he looked at her face with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Unhurried and certain, and as clear as that very particular shade of winter sky. They were married in March, in the church in Callow Creek, by the preacher whose name was not the talkative Elias of Martha's boarding house, but a steady man named Reverend Calloway, who performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and evident goodwill. Martha Gentry cried, which surprised everyone, including Martha. Cobb and Garrett and Amos were present in clean shirts, looking pleased in the specific way of ranch hands at their employer's wedding. Mr. Ackerman attended with his wife and gave a short toast at the supper afterward that was almost entirely about Ruby's filing system and was nonetheless genuinely moving. Samuel, the telegraph operator, brought a small gift wrapped in paper. Henry, the retired surveyor, brought a bottle of good whiskey. Even the preacher Elias, who had moved on by then to the next town in his circuit, had sent a written blessing that was 3 pages long and entirely characteristic. They drove out to the ranch in the April warmth, and Ruby stepped onto the porch of the Stone house as its mistress, and she stood there for a moment and looked at the spring grass beginning to show across the land, and she felt the word she had not used in so many years: home. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty, because no first year of anything worthwhile is without difficulty. But the difficulties were the kind that 2 capable people who trust each other can navigate, the ordinary difficulties of learning to share space and decision-making, and the 1,000 small negotiations of a shared life. They were good at it, which she attributed to the fact that both of them were practical, and both of them were willing to be honest when it was uncomfortable. She kept working for Mr. Ackerman 3 days a week because she was good at it, and because she had made a commitment that she intended to honor, and because, more privately, she believed in the importance of having work of her own. Flint understood this without needing it explained, which was itself one of the most significant things about him. She also took over the bookkeeping for the ranch, which had been kept in a ledger by Flint himself with competence, but without the systematic organization she could bring to it. Within a month of starting, she had identified 2 overpayments to a supplier and a billing error in the cattle records that had been costing them a modest but real sum over several years. Flint looked at the corrections with the expression of a man who is enormously relieved to have someone else take care of a category of problem. "You have a gift," he said. "I have a system," she said. "They are related but not identical." He kissed her then, in the middle of the study with the slightly uneven walls, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, and thought that she had been building toward this without knowing it for a very long time. In the second year, a drought came. It was not the worst drought the region had experienced, because the long-timers in Callow Creek had experienced worse, but it was serious enough. The creek thinned and the grass went early to straw, and the cattle needed to be kept on the northern sections of the range where a spring still ran. Flint and his hands worked long days, and Ruby managed the household with careful economy, and kept the ranch accounts with a precision that allowed them to know exactly where they stood and exactly what decisions they could afford to make. There were ranches in the surrounding country that did not weather it as well. One of the neighboring spreads, owned by a family named Carlisle, was in serious difficulty by August. Flint drove out to the Carlisle place and came back having arranged to purchase 30 head of their cattle at a fair price that would give the family enough to carry through the winter. He said nothing particular about this to Ruby, but she saw the entry when she updated the accounts, and she looked at the number and then at him across the supper table. The price was fair, she said. It was what they needed, he said. She looked at him and loved him steadily and thoroughly. The drought broke in October, with 3 days of serious rain that filled the creek and darkened the grass, and sent the birds into extraordinary noise. Ruby stood on the porch in the rain and let it fall on her face, and Flint came to stand beside her and watched her do it with an expression she had learned to read as the particular kind of happiness that is almost painful in its quality. "You are going to get thoroughly wet," he said. "I know," she said, and tilted her face up further. He laughed, a full and genuine laugh, and put his arm around her, and they stood in the rain together. The following spring their son was born. They had known since January, and she had carried the knowledge with a mix of profound gladness and realistic caution, because she understood the realities of childbirth in 1884 Texas, and she was not a woman who looked away from reality. The doctor from Callow Creek had been attentive, and Martha Gentry had come to stay for the last 3 weeks, because she had attended 4 births and was calming by temperament and deeply attached to both of them. The labor was long and difficult enough to be frightening, and ended well enough to be miraculous. He arrived in the early morning of a day in April, and his first announcement of himself was emphatic and robust, and both Ruby and the doctor laughed with relief. Flint, who had been outside the bedroom door for 14 hours with an expression of contained terror on his face, was let in when it was done. He crossed the room and stood over the small wrapped bundle in Ruby's arms, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen before and would never forget. All the quiet, contained strength of him, and underneath, it's something completely open, something undone and new. "Hello," he said softly to his son. They named him Thomas Gerald Farrow. Thomas for Martha's son, who had stood on the boarding house porch with his rifle and kept watch. Gerald for a good man who had hired Ruby when she needed it and had not deserved the uses his son made of his memory. Thomas was, from the beginning, a person with definite opinions, which both his parents found simultaneously exhausting and entertaining. He had Flint's steady gray eyes and Ruby's obstinate practicality, and he learned to walk by pulling himself along the bookshelves in the study, which meant his first year of upright motion was accompanied by books falling off shelves at irregular intervals. By the time Thomas was 3, Cobb had become his particular person outside the family, which pleased Cobb enormously and slightly complicated the question of discipline, since Cobb's view was that Thomas could do essentially no wrong. In the spring of the year Thomas turned 4, Ruby found herself expecting again. This time the knowledge arrived with less of the initial fear, because she had done this before, and because she had Flint and Martha, and the rhythm of the life they had built. And she carried it with confidence even when the early months were harder than the first time. Their daughter arrived in December, promptly and with less drama than her brother, as though she had decided to be efficient about the whole matter. She was small and dark-haired and regarded the world from her first moments with an expression of intense evaluation that made the doctor chuckle. They named her Caroline Martha Farrow. Martha Gentry, upon being told this, cried again, and then announced that she was developing an embarrassing habit and would need to stop. Thomas, upon meeting his sister, considered her for a long moment and then announced that she was very small and that he supposed she could stay. "That is generous of you," Flint told him, with complete gravity. "I know," Thomas said. The ranch in those years was prospering. The drought had not broken them, and the recovery had been stronger than expected. Flint had added 300 acres to the north and hired 2 additional hands. Ruby had reduced Mr. Ackerman's hours to 1 day a week when Caroline arrived, and she put her full bookkeeping energy into the ranch's accounts, which were by this point a substantial and complex operation that she kept in meticulous order. They had built a larger stable and extended the porch around the south and east sides of the house, so that in summer you could sit in the evening shade and see the whole spread of the land as it changed color with the setting sun. Ruby had a kitchen garden that by its 3rd year was producing more than they could use, and she had begun supplying the boarding house and 2 other households in town, which had become a small and satisfying commerce. She still walked on Sunday afternoons. Now Flint walked with her, and Thomas ran ahead chasing whatever was moving, and Caroline sat in the carrier on Flint's back with the specific satisfaction of a person being transported without effort. On one of these afternoons, in the autumn when Thomas was 5 and Caroline almost 1, they walked along the creek in the October light that was the same copper gold as the afternoon Flint had stepped between her and the crowd and said words that had changed everything. Ruby said this aloud because she said what she was thinking to him now with the ease of long practice. "This is the same kind of light as that afternoon," she said. He looked at the sky and the creek and then at her. "October light," he said. "When you stepped through the crowd," she said. "I thought I was going to die that day. And then you were there and you said those words and everything changed." He was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas attempt to catch a grasshopper in the dry grass at the creek's edge. "I was afraid," he said. She looked at him, surprised. He did not say this easily. "Not of Hartwell or the crowd," he said. "Of whether I had the standing, whether I had any right to put myself between her and them, a woman I barely knew." He paused. "And then I looked at your face and I thought, the right to it is irrelevant. She needs someone to stand there, and I am going to stand there." She looked at him for a long time. This man who had built everything he had from nothing, who had stood in a street and faced down a crowd with 6 words and the weight of his own quiet certainty, who had spent 14 years building a ranch and the better part of the last 5 years building a family with a steadiness and devotion that she still, sometimes, had to pause and accept the reality of. "You were exactly right," she said. He reached out and took her hand, there by the creek in the October light, the same as his habit had been since December of 1882, and they walked on while Thomas shouted something triumphant about the grasshopper. Caroline, from her perch on Flint's back, said something emphatic in the wordless language of almost 1-year-olds. "I agree," Flint told her, entirely seriously. Ruby started to laugh. Life in Callow Creek continued to change around them as the 1880s moved toward the 1890s and the territory changed its character. The railroad came through in 1887, not directly through Callow Creek but close enough, 10 miles south, that the effect on the cattle trade was significant. Flint drove their cattle to the rail depot now, which shortened the drive by 3 weeks and improved the condition of the herd on arrival. The price per head improved accordingly. The railroad brought other things as well. More people, more commerce, the beginnings of the kind of growth that turns a small town into a larger one. Mr. Ackerman retired in 1888 and sold his office to a younger man from Dallas named Preston, who was sharp and ambitious, and recognized immediately that Ruby Prentice Farrow was the best clerk he had ever encountered. He offered her more hours than Mr. Ackerman had, and she negotiated a rate that reflected what she was worth, which Preston accepted with the efficiency of a man who understands value. Thomas started school in 1889, at the schoolhouse that had been expanded from one room to two as the town's children multiplied. He was quick and curious, and could already read at a level that surprised his teacher, a capable young woman named Miss Hartley, who had come from Chicago. He was also, according to Miss Hartley, the most stubborn child she had taught in 6 years, which Flint and Ruby received with expressions of perfect composure that they maintained until they were outside the schoolhouse. Caroline learned to talk at an early age and did not stop. She had Flint's directness and Ruby's precision with words, which meant that by the time she was 3, she was formulating arguments of remarkable clarity for a person who had not yet mastered the full alphabet. She and Thomas argued constantly with great spirit and equal affection, and the ranch house was, in these years, loud in a way that neither Flint nor Ruby had entirely anticipated, but that both of them loved with an intensity that sometimes surprised them. Martha Gentry remained one of the fixed points of their world. Samuel, the telegraph operator, had married the baker's daughter in 1886, and they had 3 children by the time the decade ended. Cobb had not married, and seemed entirely content not to have done so. Garrett had married and moved to Abilene. Amos had become Flint's foreman, a promotion that came with a salary increase and a small house on the ranch property, and he held the position with the solid competence of someone who has been building toward it for years. The circuit court's judgment against Clarence Hartwell had been paid. Clarence had eventually retreated to San Antonio and was, according to information that arrived occasionally and without much effort through various channels, having a difficult time of it. Ruby heard this with a neutrality that had developed over years from the acute anger of the original injustice. She did not wish him well exactly, but she did not spend energy on wishing him ill either. He was a diminished figure in a life that was full of much more important things. There was a night in the summer of 1890, when Thomas was 6 and Caroline was 5, when the children had both fallen asleep after supper without their usual argument about the time, worn out by a day that had included, at various points, a visit to the Carlisle farm, a considerable quantity of fresh peaches, and an incident with the younger Carlisle boy and a wasp's nest that had ended without serious injury, but with a great deal of noise. The house was quiet. The summer night came through the open windows with the smell of grass and the sound of crickets. Flint and Ruby sat on the porch in the darkness, close together, and the sky above the ranch was thick with stars in the way it only is when you are far enough from town that the night is genuinely dark. "You remember," Ruby said quietly, "that I told you I wanted to stop moving." "Yes," he said, "on the porch of this house," she said, "in December of 1882. "I remember," he said. His arm was around her and she was leaned against his shoulder. "I did not know what I was asking for," she said. "I thought I was asking for stability, for a place. I did not understand that I was asking for all of this." He looked at the night sky and she felt him breathe. "Neither did I," he said. "I thought I was asking you to stay. I did not know I was asking for everything that comes with staying." She lifted her face to look at him in the darkness. "Is it everything you wanted?" she asked, and she was not anxious about the answer but genuinely curious, in the way she was curious about things she cared deeply about. He looked at her, and his expression in the dim starlight was the one that rearranged his face completely, the one that had been doing this to her for 8 years. "It is more than I knew how to want," he said. She kissed him, there on the porch under the stars, with the summer night around them and the children asleep inside and the land stretching out dark and peaceful in every direction. In the spring of 1891, something unexpected happened. The something was that Ruby discovered she was expecting again, which was unexpected because Caroline was already 5, and they had assumed that part of their family was complete. The discovery arrived with an initial surprise that gave way to a warmth and a gladness that was, if anything, deeper than the previous times, because they were different people than they had been, more settled in themselves and in each other. Flint received the news with an expression that took a moment to arrive, and was, when it did, the fullest and most uncomplicated happiness she had seen on his face. Thomas, when told, said that it had better not be a baby who cried all the time. Caroline, when told, immediately began negotiating for naming rights. The pregnancy went smoothly, and the delivery was the easiest of the 3, which the doctor attributed to what he called her excellent constitution, and she attributed to the considerable competence of the female body when adequately supported and not terrified. Their second son arrived in October of 1891, with something of his father's quiet quality, which was apparent from his first hours in the way that some babies are immediately and entirely themselves. He was a thoughtful baby, as much as babies can be said to be thoughtful, who looked at things with an evaluating attention that was so familiar it made Ruby laugh. They named him James Henry Farrow. James for the attorney in San Antonio, who had found the ledger entry that helped save Ruby's situation in 1882. Henry for the retired surveyor who was now 75 and enormously pleased. Henry, when told, sat very still for a moment and then said, with the careful composure of a man not accustomed to being moved, that it was a fine name for a boy and he hoped the boy would do it justice. "He will," Flint said. He was right. The 3 children grew in the particular parallel ways of siblings, different in character, and shared in the deep, unspoken language of people who have grown up in the same house with the same parents and the same land outside the same windows. Thomas was serious and steady, and loved the cattle work in a way that suggested he had inherited his father's affinity for the ranch life without needing to be taught it. Caroline was brilliant and relentless, and had informed the family at age 7 that she was going to be a teacher, which Miss Hartley, who had heard about this announcement, called entirely plausible. James was gentle and observant, and showed an early aptitude for the kind of careful attention to how things worked that made Amos say, when James was 4, that the boy was going to be an engineer. "Perhaps," Ruby said. "He took apart the pump mechanism this morning to see how it worked," Amos said. "Did he put it back together?" "Mostly," Amos said. Ruby and Flint sat together every evening after supper, when the children were doing their various things, and the house had settled into the particular domestic sound of a family at rest. They talked, or they were quiet, or they read, or Flint worked on the ranch accounts with Ruby's guidance while she read something she had been saving. And these evenings were, in the accumulated sum of them, the texture of a life that was exactly what she had meant when she said she wanted everything. She had not known what everything looked like when she asked for it. Now she did. It looked like a stone house with a porch facing south, and a library built into the wall and a kitchen garden in summer and 3 children who argued and laughed and slept in their beds at night while the Texas sky came through the windows full of stars. It looked like the specific quality of his attention when she was talking. The way he reached for her hand without thinking about it, by long habit, whenever they were walking anywhere. The 2 lines between his brows when he was worried about something and had not yet decided to say what. The way he said her name still, after nearly a decade of saying it, as though it were something he was glad to have reason to say. In 1893, when James was 2 and Caroline was 7 and Thomas was 9, Martha Gentry became ill. It was a slow illness, the kind that takes its time, and Martha faced it with the same determined practicality with which she faced everything. She remained in her house with her garden and her cat, and Ruby went to her every Tuesday and Thursday, and sometimes on Sunday when the children were at the ranch with Flint. And they sat together and talked, and Ruby managed whatever needed managing. Martha died in February of 1894, on a cold, clear morning that she had chosen. It seemed to Ruby, as efficiently as she chose everything, when the formalities were in order and the arrangements made and everyone she cared about had been told what they needed to know. She left her house to her son Thomas. She left Ruby a small cameo brooch that had been her mother's and a letter that Ruby read once and kept folded in the same oilcloth where she had once kept the copy of the ledger entry. The loss of Martha was the first real grief of their shared life, and they moved through it the way they moved through everything, together and honestly, with the knowledge that grief is not a problem to be solved but a passage to be completed. The children asked questions about death with the directness of children, and Ruby and Flint answered them as truthfully as they could, which felt right. "Will you cry forever?" Caroline asked her mother with genuine curiosity. "No," Ruby said, "but for a while." "How long is a while?" "As long as it takes," Ruby said. Caroline considered this with her characteristic evaluating expression and then nodded, apparently satisfied with the philosophy of it. The spring after Martha died, Flint put a bench on the south side of the porch, facing the garden. He built it himself, from good wood, and set it in the place where the afternoon sun was warmest in the season when the garden was at its fullest. He said nothing particular about why he had placed it there, and Ruby said nothing particular about why she understood, and the bench was exactly the right kind of memorial, the kind that is also useful. They sat on it together that summer, in the late afternoons, while the garden grew and the children were various kinds of loud in the background, and it was the right thing to have and the right place to put it. The years moved in the way that happy years do, not slowly but not without savor, carrying the seasons and the events and the accumulating weight of a life that has been built with care and intention. Thomas was 12 and then 15, and then 17, and he was growing into his father's height and his own character, which was not exactly his father's but clearly made from similar material. He worked the ranch with a commitment that was not forced on him but chosen, and he had an instinct for cattle that Amos said flatly was the best he had seen in anyone that young. Caroline went to school in Austin at 16, which was the nearest institution offering the kind of education she required, and the departure was the hardest thing that had happened in the house since Martha's death. She wrote letters every week, dense and detailed and funny, and she came home for the summers and filled the house with the particular energy of a young woman who is becoming the person she was always going to be, which was significant and slightly alarming and entirely wonderful. James, at 10, had indeed demonstrated the tendencies Amos had predicted. He could repair almost any mechanical thing on the ranch, and was increasingly interested in the question of what lay beyond the ranch, which Ruby and Flint understood without trying to contain, because a person's curiosity is not a thing to be contained but cultivated. The ranch by 1900 was 1,500 acres and one of the most reliable operations in the county. The accounts were immaculate. The cattle were in good condition and well managed. Cobb was still there, gray now and somewhat slower but present, which everyone understood to be permanent and desirable. The century turned. Ruby was 44 years old, and Flint was 49. And they stood together on the porch on the first morning of the new year and looked at the land that he had started building 14 years before she arrived, and that they had been building together for 18 years since. "What do you think the next century will be?" she asked. "Different," he said without sorrow. "Different from this one. Is that acceptable to you?" He looked at the land and then at her, with the expression that had been doing what it did to her for 18 years and showed no sign of stopping. "Everything that needs to be here is here," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and felt the solid, warm reality of him. This man who had stepped between her and a crowd with 6 words and had kept, every day since, in every way available to him, exactly what those words had promised. Thomas came back from the north section at noon, with 2 of the younger hands they had hired and a report on the state of the fence lines, and ate a massive amount of the winter soup Ruby had made and went back out again. James spent the morning in the stable with a wheel mechanism he had been examining, and appeared at noon with grease on his face and a satisfaction in his expression that meant he had fixed something. He ate almost as much as Thomas and went back to the stable. Caroline wrote from Austin, a letter that arrived 2 days into the new year, full of her characteristic energy and the news that she had been offered a position teaching arithmetic and composition at a school there, beginning in the spring, which she intended to accept, and which she reported with the confident expectation that they would be pleased, because she was right and she knew they would be. They were pleased. They sat at supper, all 4 of them at home, Flint and Ruby and Thomas and James, and read Caroline's letter aloud with the January dark outside the windows, and the fire going in the stone fireplace that Flint had built before the new room, before the extended porch, before almost everything that made the house what it was now. "She is going to teach a school full of children that her stubbornness is a virtue," Thomas said. "It is a virtue," Ruby said. "In her," Thomas allowed. "It remains to be determined in children generally." James, who was 15 and had developed a dry wit that was the least expected quality in a boy who spent most of his time with machinery, said, "She will convince them. She is very persuasive." "She is," Flint agreed. They were all quiet for a moment in the comfortable way of a family that is comfortable together, and the fire cracked, and the lamp light moved across the walls, and the old study with its slightly uneven walls was through the doorway. The books still there in their shelves, the George Eliot and the rest of the accumulated years. "Papa," James said, with the directness that was perhaps the clearest quality he had inherited from both of them simultaneously, "what is the best thing you have ever done?" The question went around the table in the silence it created. Flint looked at James and then at Thomas and then at Ruby, and he took his time, because he always took his time, and when he answered truly. "I walked through a crowd," he said. Ruby looked at him across the table, in the lamplight of the first year of a new century, in the stone house he had built, and the life they had made together. And she felt everything that she had felt standing at the door of that boarding house years ago, and everything that had come after it, and everything that would come after that. And she thought that she had been right, in December of 1882, when she told him she was willing. She had been more right than she had known how to be. Why was that the best? James asked. Because everything after it was better than everything before it, Flint said. He was looking at Ruby when he said it, and she was looking at him, and the fire burned in the fireplace his hands had built. And outside the windows the first night of the new century was dark and full of stars, and in that house, in that particular moment, everything was whole. Thomas cleared his plate and asked for more soup. James said something about the wheel mechanism that Ruby did not entirely follow, but that Thomas apparently understood. The lamp burned. The fire burned. The land lay quiet around them in the cold January dark. And Ruby Prentice Farrow, who had once pressed her back against a rough-hewn timber wall and thought she was going to die in a street in Texas, reached across the table and put her hand over her husband's hand, and felt him turn it over and hold it with the same deliberate, careful certainty with which he had held it on a creek bank in October, standing together in the light.